We're giving the car her parents gifted you to your brother. That's what my dad whispered to me 5 minutes after our first dance, at my own wedding. I was still catching my breath, Caleb's hand warm at my back, the crowd glowing under golden lights, toasting us like everything was perfect. But in that moment, I knew it wasn't our new beginning they cared about. It was still Ryan's future they prioritized, even if it meant stripping something away from me, again. I blinked, smiled, said nothing. That's what I always did. Because I'd been trained to keep the peace, not make it. But something shifted inside me that night. It wasn't about the car. It was about every small erasure, every silent trade-off they'd made with my life, without ever asking. And now, standing there in white lace and borrowed earrings, I realized I was done being the one they could quietly discard. Have you ever been betrayed so quietly, so politely, that no one noticed but you? Tell me in the comments, and if you've ever smiled through heartbreak, hit subscribe. The smile on Dad's face didn't match the words that followed, and yet I still managed to smile back, or at least something close enough to a smile that no one would notice the way my jaw clenched underneath. Around me, the reception glowed like a dream I'd been rehearsing since childhood. The rustic chic hall was strung with soft golden fairy lights that blinked and danced like fireflies above our heads. The scent of roses, real ones, not supermarket bouquets, mingled with champagne bubbles that tickled the air. Every table shimmered with glassware and laughter. People were clinking forks to glasses, cheering us into our first kiss as husband and wife like it was the sweetest thing they'd seen all year. It was sweet. It was supposed to be sweet. Caleb and I had just stepped off the dance floor, still catching our breath, his hand resting at the small of my back in a way that said, "You're safe now." His goofy grin hadn't faded yet, and it tugged a real laugh out of me despite my pulse hammering from the waltz. Then Dad walked over. He looked so at ease, as if the whole world bent toward his timing. His tux jacket hung open, his tie slightly loose, and he carried that expression he always wore when he wanted you to believe everything was fine, the kind of smile neighbors trusted and church ladies complimented. I should have known better. When he leaned in, he smelled faintly of bourbon and mint. His voice was smooth, almost conspiratorial, like he was letting me in on some pleasant surprise instead of cutting me off at the knees. "We're giving the car her parents gifted you to your brother," he said. I froze. The words landed like a punch, but softer, a punch wrapped in velvet. The champagne flute in my hand wobbled, the stem slick now, and I tightened my fingers to keep from dropping it. I blinked at him, sure I had misheard, but he just smiled wider, nodding as though I was the slow one. "Ryan needs it more. He's got that job interview coming up." Ah, so that was the story we were telling now. My mother materialized beside him, her wine glass clutched to her chest like it might shield her from my reaction. She avoided my eyes and nodded faintly, like this had already been decided behind closed doors. For a second I felt untethered, like my feet weren't quite on the ground anymore. Behind me, I felt Caleb shift. His hand fell from my back as he caught the end of the sentence and tilted his head. His brows knit, and he gave me that look, half question, half concern, but he didn't speak. Not yet. "You're okay with that, right?" Dad added. I wanted to laugh, a sharp, humorless laugh that would have sliced right through the room, but instead, I forced my mouth into something resembling agreement. My cheeks hurt from the effort. Ryan appeared just then, of course, like he'd been waiting for his cue. He came sauntering up from the bar, his bow tie already undone, his grin stretching ear to ear like he'd just won something he hadn't earned. He slung an arm lazily over Mom's shoulder and glanced at me like we were all in on some harmless joke together. "Relax," he said, grinning. "It's just a car. Just a car." The car my in-laws had handed to me and Caleb 2 nights ago at the rehearsal dinner. A silver Highlander, clean title, signed and hugged over as a token of our new life together. A fresh start. My fingers tightened on the stem of my glass. I could feel heat crawling up my neck and settling just under my skin, but my voice wouldn't come. Mom took a sip of her wine, her eyes darting away as if the fairy lights above us might save her. "You'll be fine," she murmured. "You can share Caleb's truck for now, until things settle." Things settle. Was there an earthquake I had missed? Caleb caught my eye again. This time his look sharpened, his wedding glow giving way to something steadier. A silent question lingered in his expression. Your call. I'm with you. And for that, I loved him a little more. I swallowed and forced a laugh, the kind you practice at family holidays when someone says something so absurd you can't quite believe it. Ryan, emboldened, added, Come on, Mal, you work remote now, right? You don't even drive that much. I didn't answer. 6 years in the Air Force. Overseas tours, holidays missed, birthdays forgotten because duty called. And now, apparently, that meant I didn't even deserve wheels. I wondered if Ryan even remembered that I used to work double shifts just to afford a car of my own when I was his age, back when he was crashing dirt bikes and having ice cream bought for him as consolation. My throat tightened. Dad leaned closer then, his smile never faltering. It settled then. Ryan really appreciates it. And just like that, the punchline was delivered, and I was expected to laugh along. But Caleb didn't laugh. Instead, he stepped ever so slightly closer, not enough for anyone else to notice, and let his pinky finger brush against mine where my hand rested on the tablecloth. I glanced at him, and he nodded. A silent promise. We're a team, even here, even now. I let the words slide off my skin, even though they stuck in my chest. The room spun in shades of ivory and gold. The DJ announced something light and cheerful in the background, and guests whooped and clinked glasses. Somewhere near the dance floor, my cousin's toddler giggled while chasing bubbles. I smiled back at Dad. I smiled at Mom. I even smiled at Ryan, who looked like he'd already started mentally parking his new prize in their driveway. But it wasn't agreement. I felt my pulse steady, low and deliberate now, like it did before inspection during training. My hands trembled once under the table before I flattened them on my lap. You okay? Caleb whispered under his breath. Fine, I lied. Ryan tilted his head, watching me like a dog waiting for a treat. You sure? You're quiet, he said. I lifted my glass, my fingers finally steady. Just taking it all in, I murmured. And I was. The fairy lights, the roses, the sound of forks on china, the faces of people who'd shown up to celebrate us, not knowing we were already being split into us and them. I didn't speak, not yet. But my silence wasn't agreement. It was strategy. Somewhere inside, a door I thought I'd bolted shut swung wide open, and the woman I'd trained to be, the one who didn't flinch at orders, who didn't blink when confronted, quietly stepped forward. Dad clapped Ryan on the back, already moving toward the bar to toast his big opportunity. Mom sipped and looked everywhere but at me. Ryan leaned against the table, grinning like the lottery ticket had already been cashed. And me? I sat there, bouquet petals still clinging to my dress, fingers tight around the stem of my glass, already counting the steps it would take to remind them what happens when you mistake silence for surrender. You'd think family wouldn't pick a fight in a wedding dress. You'd be wrong. The ballroom shimmered around me as though nothing had happened. Strings of warm lights crisscrossed above, casting soft shadows across the polished wood floor. Laughter bubbled up from every corner, clinking champagne flutes, faint applause from the cutting of the cake, but none of it felt real anymore. I sat at our table, my fingers tangled in the linen napkin on my lap, twisting it tighter and tighter. The tips of my shoes barely peeked out from beneath the layers of my dress, and even though my smile stayed fixed in place, my jaw ached from holding it there. Caleb leaned toward me slightly, just enough that I could feel the weight of his presence. He didn't say a word. He never needed to. His hand found mine under the tablecloth, his thumb grazing my knuckles. That quiet question lingered between us, unspoken but clear. What now? Across the room, Dad was holding court with a cluster of distant relatives. He had a glass of bourbon in one hand, his jacket folded over a chair, his shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows. His laugh cut through the music now and then, booming and confident like nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. Mom stood beside him, eyes darting around the room, her hand resting on his arm. She nodded along to his stories as if they were still charming, as if she hadn't just watched him gut me with a single sentence. And Ryan, my younger brother, lounged against the bar like a guest of honor, his bow tie hanging loose, a smirk carved into his face. His voice carried over the clatter of dishes and the soft strains of jazz. "It just makes more sense this way," he said loudly to no one in particular. "She doesn't even drive much. I'll take good care of it." Something bitter rose in my throat, but I swallowed it down. Without a word, I pushed back my chair and slipped away toward the gift table. It stood along the wall, draped in ivory linen, stacked with cards and boxes wrapped in shimmering foil. I pretended to fuss with the envelopes, adjusting them just so. My hands trembled anyway, clumsy despite the practiced grace I'd worn like armor all day. Behind my eyes, old memories bloomed, uninvited and sharp. The kitchen of our childhood home in Ohio came to life. Dim yellow light above, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the background. Dad's voice echoed in my head, sharp as ever. "Why can't you do anything right? Ryan's room needs more space for his things. You're fine where you are." I could still see him standing in the doorway of what should have been my room, handing Ryan the keys to it like it had always been his. Another memory surfaced. Ryan at 16, sitting sheepishly on the front steps as the tow truck hauled away his first car, crumpled and smoking. Dad clapped him on the shoulder, chuckling. "Boys will be boys. You'll learn." The next day, a shiny new car appeared in the driveway, a reward for crashing the first. And then me, at 18, boarding a Greyhound bus bound for basic training. No fanfare, no good luck party, just a curt nod from Dad and a quick hug from Mom, who whispered, "Be safe." I blinked and forced myself back to the present, smoothing the corner of an envelope until it was perfectly straight. A woman in a green satin dress paused nearby to gush about the flower arrangements. Absolutely beautiful, and I managed to thank her without my voice cracking. She didn't notice my hands shaking. Nobody ever did. Caleb appeared at my side, so quiet I didn't notice him until he slipped something beneath my fingers on the table, a small, unassuming envelope. I looked down at it. Inside were the documents we'd prepared months ago: legal protections, transfers of title, contingency plans, a safety net, our quiet rebellion against what we both knew might come. Caleb didn't say a word, but when I glanced at him, his eyes said enough. Across the room, Mom met my gaze for the first time that evening. She froze for just a second, barely perceptible, but it was enough. Something flashed across her face. Guilt, worry, or calculation? It was hard to say anymore. I smiled. The same smile I'd worn in uniform, standing at attention during inspections, while officers scrutinized me for cracks. Controlled, deliberate. "Not yet," I whispered, leaning toward Caleb so only he could hear. "Let them dig their own hole first." Caleb's fingers curled around mine under the table, firm and steady. "You're terrifying," he murmured, low enough that only I caught it. For the first time that night, a real smile tugged at the corners of my mouth. Because he wasn't wrong. And I was just getting started. There's a point where silence stops being noble and starts being permission. That point arrived sometime between the second glass of champagne and the fading strains of Sinatra's "The Way You Look Tonight." I sat tall at our table, back straight despite the ache in my shoulders, my eyes scanning the thinning crowd. The once bustling ballroom had begun to empty. Guests in satin gowns and tuxedos clutched slices of cake on paper napkins as they hugged goodbye, offering compliments about the lovely evening. Little clusters of family and old friends lingered near the bar, their laughter softer now, punctuated by the clink of melting ice. But under it all, beneath the laughter and the polite music, was the ringing in my head, that quiet, sharp fury that had been building all night. Caleb sat beside me, one arm draped loosely on the back of my chair, his presence steady, grounding me. When I glanced at him, he didn't say a word. He just met my gaze, his expression calm, and gave me the smallest nod. And that was enough. I slipped my fingers into my clutch and felt the envelope waiting there, thin but heavy with everything I had never said aloud. My thumb traced the edge of the paper. Across the room, Ryan leaned against the bar like he owned the place. His bow tie was completely undone now, hanging limply around his collar. He raised his glass, laughing loudly at something Dad said. Dad's hand clapped against Ryan's back, his smile so wide it almost looked sincere. And Mom, she stood between them, sipping from a half-empty flute, eyes darting around the room like she was already calculating the damage control she'd have to do later. Just weeks ago, her voice had echoed in my mind after one of our rare phone calls. "Just think about it," she'd said. "Ryan needs this. He's struggling, sweetheart. You don't even drive much anymore." I'd bitten back the words I wanted to say then, that my car wasn't just a car, that it was one of the few things they couldn't take credit for or hand to Ryan as a consolation prize. But tonight I'd stopped biting my tongue. I stood slowly, sliding the envelope fully into my clutch. Caleb's hand brushed mine under the table, briefly catching my wrist before letting go. Not a question, just quiet encouragement. The silk of my dress whispered against the polished wood floor as I walked toward them, weaving between tables where sleepy children leaned on their mothers' laps and couples posed for last-minute selfies. A few guests glanced up as I passed, but most were too wrapped in their own conversations to notice. At the bar, Dad's laugh cut short when he finally caught sight of me approaching. Ryan's grin didn't falter, not yet, but Mom's lips pressed into a thin line. I stopped just short of them, clutch resting neatly in my hands. "Dad, Ryan." My voice carried just enough to hush the group around them. Ryan chuckled softly, swirling his drink. "Didn't expect to see you over here so soon. Thought you'd be basking or whatever." The weight of all those years, deployment homecomings where no one showed up at the airport, promotions dismissed with a distracted, "That's nice, honey." Birthdays spent alone while Ryan's failures were met with banners and parties, pressed down on my chest. But my voice stayed steady. "We need to talk now." Mom's gaze darted toward the remaining guests. A few had already gone quiet, their eyes flicking our way. Dad tried to soften the moment with a chuckle, sliding his hands into his pockets. "Sweetheart, this really isn't the—" I opened the clutch and handed him the envelope. He froze, confused, his smile faltering as he unfolded the paper. Ryan leaned in, still smirking until his eyes scanned the first few lines. "What's this?" Dad's voice dropped, thick with something between suspicion and disbelief. Mom stepped closer, peeking over his arm. When she saw the heading, a formal notice outlining the legal protections and transfers I'd quietly put in place months ago, her eyes widened. "This is a joke," Ryan said, snatching the paper halfway through, but his voice cracked just slightly. My fingers itched to take it back, but I held my ground, lifting my chin higher. Around us, a hush settled over the bar. People turned halfway in their seats, trying not to look, but failing. Someone's phone camera even rose briefly before being lowered again. "You're threatening us?" Mom hissed, leaning in so only I could hear. Her breath smelled faintly of wine and wedding cake. "At your wedding?" I met her gaze evenly, letting the silence stretch for a beat longer than was comfortable. Then I spoke. "No." I slipped my hands back into my clutch and closed it with a quiet snap. "I'm protecting myself, at last." For a moment, none of them moved. Ryan's smirk had dissolved completely now, replaced by something darker. Dad's fingers tightened around the paper. Mom straightened, her mouth opening slightly as if to respond, but nothing came out. Behind me, I felt Caleb's presence again, calm and certain. His hand came to rest gently at the small of my back. Guests murmured quietly, their voices just low enough to blend with the faint hum of the last, slow song playing over the speakers. I didn't flinch. The air in the room shifted, the same way it had the day I walked into my commanding officer's office and requested a transfer after months of being ignored. The same way it had every time I chose to stand my ground, no matter how small the hill. And this time, the hill was mine. It wasn't just a car. It was every quiet betrayal rolled into a set of keys. For years, I told myself it didn't matter, that the comments, the choices, the dismissals were just little paper cuts that would heal. But tonight, in the golden glow of our wedding reception, I could feel them all at once. I stood still, my phone warm in my hand, my other hand smoothing down the front of my dress, almost absently. Caleb stayed close, just behind me, a silent, steady presence. Even though my skin felt hot, my chest tight, my voice was calm, too calm. The reception hall around us still sparkled under strings of fairy lights, with clusters of guests chatting, finishing cake, raising glasses. The smell of champagne and buttercream lingered. But now, a hush was beginning to spread like spilled wine on linen as word of our argument moved through the crowd. People were pretending not to watch, but I could feel every eye on me. Dad forced a chuckle. That same laugh he'd used when I was a kid, whenever he wanted to pretend nothing was wrong. "Let's not make a scene, sweetheart," he said, his hand waving vaguely like he could simply sweep this away. His smile was brittle at the edges now. "We'll talk tomorrow, or over breakfast. Everyone's tired." I tilted my head just enough to let the silence settle around us. "You already made the scene," I replied evenly. My voice surprised even me, soft but carrying. "I'm just finishing it." Across from me, Mom flinched, her fingers tight around the stem of her glass. She shot me a quick, almost pleading glance, then quickly masked it as she glanced toward the guests and gave them a polite smile. Ryan finally barked out a laugh, leaning on the bar with one hand and gesturing vaguely with the other. "It's just a car," he scoffed, as though the words carried weight. "You're really gonna do this here? Over a car? You're embarrassing yourself." My breath caught, then steadied. That hot thread of anger twisted into something colder, sharper. Without looking at him, I unlocked my phone. "You mean this car?" I asked, turning the screen toward them. The video played on silent. Ryan sneaking into my garage late at night, fumbling with the lock before slipping inside like he belonged there. The sight of his hand caressing the hood of the car with an ugly sort of familiarity made my stomach turn even now. A few soft gasps rippled behind me, followed by hurried whispers. Ryan's face went pale before he lunged at me, fingers outstretched. "Give me that!" But my hand darted back and locked the screen before he touched it. The phone slipped into my clutch, safe. "Enough!" Caleb's voice cut cleanly through the moment. He stepped forward then, his broad frame between us. Ryan dropped his hands and stepped back, muttering something I couldn't catch. Dad's shoulders stiffened. His eyes flicked between me and Caleb. "I told you to stop," I said. My voice was steady now, firmer. Dad opened his mouth like he might argue, then stopped. Mom finally spoke, her voice a low hiss. "We'll talk about this later," she said, her tone sharp as broken glass. I met her gaze squarely, tilting my head just slightly, letting my lips curve into a faint smile. "No," I said. "We're done talking." Her eyes widened, and for a fleeting second, guilt, or something close to it, passed over her face before she looked away. I straightened my dress again, feeling the cool satin beneath my fingers, and forced another faint smile at a guest who was clearly pretending to fuss with her plate while staring at us. A memory, uninvited but vivid, surfaced. Dad's voice when I was 16. "You don't need much. Ryan needs more." At 16, I'd believed it. At 32, I could finally see it for what it was. Around me, the room's buzz returned slowly, hesitantly, conversations picking back up in low voices, laughter sounding forced. Ryan turned toward the bar again, muttering, trying to reassemble his composure, though his hands shook when he reached for his drink. Mom adjusted her shawl and brought her glass to her lips, but her hand trembled faintly. Dad stayed put, his eyes dark, his jaw tight. I turned back toward Caleb, who was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read, admiration and quiet worry. When I reached for his hand, he squeezed mine, his thumb brushing against my knuckles. "You okay?" he murmured, his words just for me. "I am now," I whispered back. And it was true. One guest passed close enough to murmur, "Lovely wedding," and I smiled faintly at them too, as though everything was just as it should be. Because it was. Every quiet betrayal over the years, dismissed homecomings, promotions ignored, my room given away when I joined the military, had sharpened into this single moment. I felt no shame, only clarity. And as I stood there, my dress perfectly straight, my clutch tucked against me, Caleb at my side, I let myself exhale fully for the first time that night. I'd spent so many years learning to stay quiet, to swallow my feelings, to avoid upsetting anyone. But that silence had only ever bought them permission. Not anymore. I tilted my chin, let my gaze sweep the room one more time, and allowed myself a real smile, faint but steady, as though I'd finally claimed something back. Something more important than a car. Myself. Some lines you draw in the sand. This one I carved in stone. The quiet of the reception hall deepened, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The DJ, bless his awkward timing, had dialed the music down to a low instrumental hum that did nothing to disguise the tension, crackling like static in the air. Plates with half-eaten cake and gold forks sat abandoned on white-clothed tables. Even the candles on the centerpieces flickered hesitantly. I stood straighter than I ever had before, my spine long, my shoulders back. My heels didn't even wobble this time. In my clutch was the second envelope, heavier than its weight should have felt, and colder than my fingers. Across the room, Ryan still leaned on the bar, his drink forgotten. His cheeks flushed an ugly pink against the stark white of his dress shirt, his tie loosened, eyes narrowed on me as though he couldn't quite decide whether to laugh, scoff, or spit. Caleb stood at my side, calm and solid, like always. I could feel his quiet strength radiating through the faint press of his hand against my back. Not pushing me forward, not pulling me back, just reminding me he was there. Dad and Mom sat now at one of the tables closer to the dance floor. Both of them had stopped pretending they weren't watching. Their expressions matched, wounded pride wrapped in disbelief. A couple of Caleb's relatives sat 2 tables down, pretending to fuss with napkins but not really hiding their approval. One of his cousins even gave me the faintest nod when our eyes met. I reached into my clutch and drew the envelope out. Ryan straightened like he expected me to crumble under his stare. But I didn't. I walked toward him deliberately, the sound of my heels muted by the carpet. His eyes tracked me the whole way, and when I stopped a few feet in front of him, his smirk returned, reflexive, rehearsed. "You think you're better than us?" he sneered under his breath, loud enough for just me to hear. My answer was silent, in my bones. I don't think. I know what I won't be anymore. I held the envelope out toward him. "For you," I said evenly. My voice was calm, but inside, I could feel the thrum of my pulse in my neck and wrists. He let out a short laugh, mocking, and snatched it from my hand. But his bravado lasted only as long as it took him to break the seal and start reading. I watched his face drain of color, the arrogance slipping line by line as the legal language sank in. A no-contact notice, property boundaries officially enforced, the kind of paper that turns sneers into silence. Behind me, I heard Mom's sharp gasp, followed by a shaky exhale. "This isn't," Ryan started, but his voice cracked halfway through. He swallowed and tried again, weaker. "You can't," but he didn't finish. He crumpled the paper in his hand, but didn't tear it. I tilted my head and let him look at me fully. Dad finally found his voice and stood halfway up from his chair. His hands were flat on the table, knuckles white. "You've changed," he said, his tone full of accusation. The words hung in the air between us, and for the first time all night my lips curved into something almost like a smile. "No," I said, steady and quiet, but carrying all the way to him. "You just stopped getting away with it." Something in him faltered at that, his eyes darting toward the floor for a moment before he lowered himself back into his seat. Ryan stood there for another long breath, his hand still clenched around the crumpled paper, but the fight in his shoulders melted. He looked smaller somehow, and for the first time, he didn't have anything left to say. I let the silence fill the space where their protests might have been. Then I turned, smoothed the fabric of my dress, and walked back to Caleb without a word. When I reached him, he slipped his hand into mine. It was warm and sure, his thumb tracing lazy circles over the back of my hand. "Still with me?" he murmured quietly. "Always," I whispered back. The DJ, perhaps sensing the lull, changed the track to something soft and slow again. The few remaining guests began murmuring to each other, the clink of glasses returning in cautious increments. I reached for my glass of champagne on the table and lifted it carefully. My hand tightened just enough around the stem for my knuckles to pale, but my voice stayed calm. I clinked my glass lightly against Caleb's and let a faint smile spread over my face. "To boundaries," I said. He smiled at me then, warm and proud, and raised his glass too. "To boundaries," he echoed. And for the first time in years, the words didn't feel like a battle cry. They felt like a promise kept. I took a slow sip, savoring the crisp taste on my tongue, the weight of the room finally shifting. When I set the glass down again, I straightened my dress once more and felt lighter somehow. A line had been drawn. "No," carved. And it was mine to keep. there's a silence that feels heavy, and one that feels like air. As the last note of the previous song faded, the room shifted around me. The weight that had been pressing on my chest for years seemed to lift, molecule by molecule, like someone cracking a window in a stuffy house. My family's chairs sat empty now. The folded napkins and half-drunk glasses on their table stood as quiet witnesses to what had just happened. Their departure was as wordless as it was overdue. No slammed doors, no final barbs, just silence and the faint smell of Dad's cologne still hanging in the air. I stood there for a beat, watching the door they'd disappeared through, expecting some flicker of regret to hit me. But it didn't. Instead, I just felt clear. The music picked up again, a lighter, faster melody this time, and laughter slowly bubbled back into the room. A pair of kids in tiny suits darted between tables, clutching cupcakes, their cheeks smeared with frosting. Fairy lights twinkled above them as if nothing at all had happened. Out of the corner of my eye, Harper appeared. She slipped in quietly, her gold heels barely making a sound on the parquet floor. She had that way about her, the kind of presence that didn't fill a room but warmed it. She leaned in, her perfume like lavender and something sharper, and whispered just above the din, "You're better than good," she said. Her smile was small but full of pride, the kind of smile someone wears when they've seen you at your worst and still choose to show up. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, and this time, my own smile wasn't forced. "Thank you," I murmured, and I meant it. Across the room, Caleb caught my eye. He was leaning against the far table now, glass in hand, the faintest curve at his lips as he raised it toward me. It wasn't showy or performative, just a quiet toast between two people who knew exactly what it cost to get here. I raised my glass back, just enough for him to see, and then set it down. The heels that had carried me through tonight suddenly felt unnecessary. One by one, I slid them off and tucked them beneath the table, feeling the cool floor against my soles. My clutch fit neatly under my arm, leaving my hands free in more ways than one. I stepped toward the dance floor barefoot, my dress brushing softly around my ankles. The crowd had thickened again, the DJ turning up the tempo, the room full of chatter and clinking glasses and children darting through legs. No one was watching me now, and that was exactly how I wanted it. Caleb met me halfway, his hand finding mine with the ease of muscle memory. "You okay?" he asked gently, though his eyes already seemed to know the answer. "I'm better than okay," I said, and I was surprised to find it was true. We moved together to the music, not the choreographed, polite steps we'd practiced for the first dance, but something looser, freer, the kind of dance that came from somewhere deeper, where you didn't care who saw you or how it looked. A burst of laughter rose from one table when someone tipped over a chair by accident, but it all felt far away. At some point, I caught Harper watching me from the edge of the floor, her arms crossed lightly, her head tilted in approval. I remembered something I'd told her months ago when she'd called to vent about her own family. "Someday," I'd promised her then, my voice cracking, "I'm going to stop fixing everyone else's mess." And here I was. I let the thought settle as the music reached a crescendo. I reached back, unhooked my bouquet from the crook of my arm, and without ceremony, tossed it high over my shoulder. It soared for a moment, catching the light before landing in the hands of a girl I didn't even know. She gasped and laughed as her friends cheered, and I felt a rush of something like relief. As though with that bouquet, I'd thrown away all the weight of what didn't belong to me. All the mess that wasn't mine to fix. Caleb and I stood together side by side, and for the first time tonight I realized I wasn't bracing for what came next. I was here. The DJ transitioned seamlessly into another upbeat song, the kind people couldn't help but move to. I tucked my clutch tighter under my arm, lifted my chin, and let Caleb spin me into the next verse. As we swayed, I thought, this is mine now, finally, fully mine. The thought was light. Air, not stone. And as the music rose around me, I smiled, really smiled, and let myself finally belong to this moment. As I stood barefoot on the dance floor, my heels tucked under my arm and Caleb's hand warm in mine, the air felt lighter than it had in years. The music swirled around me, and I caught sight of the empty chairs where my family had sat, and I felt no sadness. Instead, I felt clarity, like a window had finally opened after years of being stuck shut. I thought of all the quiet times I had swallowed my words just to keep the peace. And I realized peace is not something you beg for, it's something you build. Sometimes standing up for yourself doesn't look like a fight, it looks like stillness. It looks like smiling at a stranger while your heart learns to heal. Love without respect is just a shadow of what love is meant to be. We all deserve to draw our lines and still keep room in our hearts for grace. Tonight, I chose to dance. I chose to let go of what hurt me and to hold on to what truly belongs to me. If this story speaks to you, feel free to share your thoughts or simply carry its quiet strength into your own life. Sometimes standing your ground isn't loud. It's calm, it's final. If you've ever had to choose peace over pleasing everyone, you're not alone. Tell me your story in the comments. I read everyone. And if this hit close to home, don't forget to like, share, and hit subscribe. Because some stories deserve to be heard, especially the quiet ones.